Our next speaker for today's evening has invested almost 2 decades of experience working across the fields of sustainability, design and system thinking, urban policy and environmental science. Holds an MBA in sustainable business from Presidio Graduate School. She worked at Saatchi & Saatchi to design and deliver sustainability programs with companies such as Walmart, NBC Universal, Duke Energy, Procter & Gamble, and at the collaborative strategy and design firm Helsinki Group. She was also an adjunct faculty at Parsons New School in a program that integrated design thinking, systems thinking, urban policy, and environmental science. Currently, she's a part of Forum for the Future, which is a leading international sustainability nonprofit. The organization specializes in addressing critical global challenges by catalyzing change in key systems from food, apparel, and energy to shipping. She has also developed a flagship program including Circular Leap Asia, an innovation program for Asian apparel manufacturers to accelerate the shift towards circular economy solutions. She's currently working on a project to reduce ocean microfiber pollution. I would want to call out it here. She's currently working on a project to reduce ocean microfiber pollution, which is, I'm sure, very important for all of us, by the fashion industry as part of 8 selected projects under the UNDP's Ocean Innovation Challenge. Ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together and invite Ms. Ariel Muller, Managing Director, Asia, Forum for the Future. Ariel, thank you for joining us.
Oh, there we go. I was muted. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. And I love that introduction. I was like, oh, that sounds great. I love all the things that person's doing. All right. I will go ahead and share my screen and get us share just a few of the things that I wanted to share with the group today. And just a moment. I seem to be having trouble sharing the screen. Let me try another format to do this in. So unfortunately, it's not enabling me to share the screen right now. So I'm not sure what I should do. Let me see if I can do that. Can you give me a moment to change this to a PDF? All right, there we go. Everyone can see the screen and I can be heard. I am hoping. So I guess, thank you. I can see your emojis, which is great. It gives me some sense of reassurance after a little bit of technical challenge. So I'm going to go ahead and jump in and give you an introduction to the organization I work for, which is Forum for the Future, which is a nonprofit sustainability organization. And we have offices across New York, Mumbai, London, and I'm based here in Singapore. And we're really focused on, as we come out of COVID and in the context of this transition that we're in, how do we ensure that we are actually making a transition that is deeply transformative versus a shallow transition? And I'll go into that a little bit more in terms of what I mean in that context. Now, I had a wonderful introduction, which I greatly appreciated. But just to introduce myself, I am an American, but I've been in Singapore for about 8 years now, and then have had this deep passion for how do we actually bring business together to be a transformational change agent to address these really complex sustainability challenges that we have, whether it's on the justice side or whether it's on the environmental and sustainability side. And I work with teams that are based in Mumbai and Singapore to help take this lens of how do we shape these transitions. And then my deep passion and expertise is in futures and systems thinking. So when I think back on my experience, and I think about this moment, and I think about the audience that's here, which is a cohort of leaders, and I imagine with extraordinary circles of influence when we think about this moment in time and what leadership might mean. I thought it's a big complex challenge in terms of sustainability. And I thought what I might do is take 3 stories, short stories, and use these as ways to tell what I think is really important when we think about this transition to a sustainable future. So the stories are What the Hell is Water, 3 Horizons, and the story of our children. So the first story, the story of What the Hell is Water, is a story about transformation. So there are 2 young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the 2 young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" So the point of this fish story is that the most obvious and sometimes important realities are often the ones that are the hardest to see and the hardest to talk about. And often we're participating in them, and we even reinforce them without even being aware of what those systems are. Our current social economic system is one of these realities that we're participating in, and it's delivering significant unintended consequences to the systems that actually sustain us. So these include pollution, the drought, fires, flooding, zoonotic diseases like COVID, the 6 major extinction in terms of biodiversity loss, microfiber pollution, which recently there was a report that now microfiber plastics are actually showing up in our blood because it's such a pervasive pollution. This impact, this collective impact of our economic systems on the planet Earth, has actually begun to be designated a new geological epoch in terms of the history of the Earth, because the impact on the planet has been so great. And it's called the Anthropocene. So this social economic system, or the water, in terms of the story, is based on an economic model of growth without limits. It incentivizes maximizing profit while externalizing, or not even considering, environmental and social cost. And while I recognize the model has delivered much value and innovation, it is ultimately, genuinely unsustainable. We live on a planet with finite resources. Right, so that's not an easy problem to solve, though, is it? It's a systemic challenge. And when we face systemic challenges, it's quite difficult to know how to navigate those as individuals. So it may help to explore what are some of those frameworks and tools that help us to think about a problem in a systemic way. So this is a framework that we often use at Forum, and it talks about when you're creating change in a system, what are the different levels at which you might create change. I'm going to start at the bottom, which is mental models, which is the most powerful lever in terms of creating change. And then next up is looking at relationships and connections and power dynamics, and these in turn begin to shape policies, practices, and resource flows. So our work is actually looking at how do we create transformational change in terms of helping to shift mental models, relational change in terms of justice, and do we have the right people at the table, in the hope that we can begin to create structural change. And for transformational change, this is the place where we need to change those mental models from growth for growth's sake. So what if this is actually a crisis of imagination? What if we are actually in this type of water that we actually even can't imagine any other type of model? What if we could imagine different models, one that prioritizes a just and regenerative economy over just growth for growth's sake? or it prioritized human well-being as an interdependent with natural ecosystems. If you begin to change those mental models, how would that then in turn begin to change other aspects of the system? Now, this isn't an idea that's necessarily new, as much as it may seem radical in terms of saying it now because we've been living in it for most of our lifetimes. It's actually something Indigenous communities have known for some time in terms of this relationship of interdependence. And there's a great quote that I think is well known actually around the world, but is when the last tree is cut, the last river poisoned, and the last fish dead, we will discover that we can't eat money. And I went and found this quote recently because there is so much work happening in the corporate sector right now around corporations understanding the biodiversity footprint, doing different type of frameworks in terms of their climate contribution, when in fact we've had this knowledge within our communities in previous generations and in previous cultures. So I think part of the solution as we move forward is actually going to be how inclusive are the conversations that we're having about the future of the planet and our future solutions. So the messages in this story of what the hell is water is see the water. Understand the long-term consequences of a social economic system based on perpetual economic growth without considering environmental and social economics. Decide what role you want to play. Are you building the new? If you believe there is the possibility for that, or are you going to ride out this old system? And then begin to catalyze and imagine what might those possibility of different mental models be. Now, for sure, I know this almost seems too difficult to do, but there is evidence that we have had these types of different mental models before, and I believe it is something we can create in the future. And it may be that this generation, it's about beginning to ask those questions such that future generations can begin to experiment with them. So this is the message around leadership in terms of what the hell is water? So the next story is Three Horizons. And it's a little bit of, oh, great, that's conceptually really interesting about systems change and mental models. But what does this actually mean in practice? Because I actually work inside an organization that is very much in this paradigm. So I'm going to introduce some of the ways we help to catalyze these types of conversations. So the good news in this story is the world is waking up. And while still falling short of the total investment needed for the transition to a low carbon economy in the time needed, society is beginning to recognize that our ecosystems are genuinely finite and fragile, and that we need to not only decarbonize, but to ecologize. The fish story challenge, though, to this moment of incredible tsunami of investments and activities is, are we genuinely introducing new transformative mental models, or are we just extending those extractive and exploitative business models of the past as we have this rapid investment into solutions to our different crises? And again, how do we discern the difference in terms of this era of greenwashing? Increasingly, there is this sense of momentum. Simultaneously, there's increasing critique that ESG is actually a cover for what isn't genuine action. Now, I did have some animation in these slides because they're PDF'd. I'm not quite sure how they're going to work out, so we'll see. So the proposal here is we need to learn to think across different time zones or three different horizons at the same time. So I'll walk you through these. So Three Horizons, there is a management framework that's used. It's probably been used before and you're familiar with it. I'm going to introduce some new tweaks to it in the context of this new type of mental model. But in essence, it's based on the premise that things are always going through growth and decline over time. So across the bottom, you have time, and across the top, you have strategic fit. As a leader of an organization, you're always looking for how can I be managing my company so that it fits with that external context. Ideally, you want to be at the top of that curve. So that first horizon, Horizon 1, tends to be where we are today. And these are the mental models we have today. And this is the way many of our organizations are designed. And the management approach there tends to be operational excellence. It's about getting efficiency out of what you currently do. But there are signs today and in the current moment of what might be that third horizon, of what might actually be transformational. And I'll walk you through an example of this after we go through the framework. And so the management approach on that third horizon, which might be 2030, might be 2040, tends to be visionary. And actually, how can we imagine what might be different and begin to introduce what might be a regenerative and just mental model to underpin a new economy? And that Second horizon, which I skipped, is your innovation horizon. And that's where you're saying, we're going to go ahead and invest in terms of what we think we can prioritize now in the most immediate term for that longer term vision. What's happened in the past is that people will innovate based on what's enabled success in the past, and they'll continue to do the same thing. But when we face the level of disruption that we have in the future from climate change impacts and a number of other, the digital disruption as well, we need innovation that's based on that future context. And so we often take people through futures processes to actually imagine what that future might be like for their organization. So I'm going to introduce a concept here, which is that you can have a Horizon 2 minus, or you can have Horizon 2 plus. And this is a way to look at the type of innovation that you're doing to ensure, is it actually moving towards transformation, or is it just extending the Horizon 1 business models further out? So here's an example, and it was intended to be animated in a really beautiful way. So I'll walk you through it. So under Horizon 1, this is actually a company that I'm working with right now, and they're a beef manufacturer, and they're based in New Zealand. And under Horizon 1, it's how efficiently can they run those farms, looking at water, looking at solar energy, things like that. But simultaneously, in the current system today, we can begin to see the signals that the beef sector is going to be under, or is already under, extraordinary pressure in terms of the needing to transform. We can see the plant-based protein beginning to, aiming to replace it. There's proposals of different types of beef tax based on its carbon emissions. And so somehow we have to understand, what does that vision look like actually for a beef industry? So a Horizon 2 minus, if I'm going to innovate in terms of what I think for this company, our H2 minus would be, actually, we're just going to do greener beef. Our cows are fed this, they're on this type of grass. New Zealand is actually one of the most carbon effective places to have cows because it's naturally suited for grass. And we're just going to see how green we can get our cows. Now, a Horizon 2 plus, what Forum wants to do with the beef company is to say, actually, how do you look beyond beef? Your farmers have land. What are the other ways that we're going to create land? What are the other ways, like carbon ecosystem contribution? What other ways can the farmers benefit? And it's beginning to have an entirely new framework where you're not just looking, I'm going to continue a really, smart nose to tail, we used every single part of the cow business model. I'm actually going to look at how this business model transforms in a low carbon economy and begin to build that vision. So the work we'll be doing with them is looking at that tension. And one of the questions we'll be asking is, what's the mental model we have underneath when we create those solutions? And for them, one of the things they've been talking about is that it's about our value, it's about our purpose. And this is what we want to stand for in the future, irregardless of what the future might hold. And that's one of the ways we're navigating that future uncertainty, building scenarios of what might happen and saying, if you know your purpose, you'll find a way to be prepared for that future. So that's just a really important piece, I think, in terms of what it means to enable this transition, is to begin to also have a mindset that's around, it's purpose-driven, not just profit-driven, not just growth-driven. So I'll do a little bit of Tesla, just as a quick example. So Horizon 1, which we're moving rapidly out of. And actually, I think what's going to happen in the next 10 years is these curves are actually not going to be these low sloping, nice curves. They're actually going to get much shorter and tighter and be much more disruptive. So fuel efficient car, Horizon 1. Horizon 2 would be, how well are we selling our EVs? What Tesla did, however, or Elon Musk did, was actually say, we're going to open source the battery technology to actually change the whole transportation system. We don't want to just make a car and sell a lot of cars. We don't want to just own the IP vis-a-vis our battery. We actually want to open source that battery so everyone begins to have a battery, and we are building this network at which the system that'll support our EVs. And so when you think about the purpose of moving from selling cars to actually, it's about how do we actually create a new transport grid in this sustainable future. So again, moving through those different horizons. Now, that doesn't mean he's thought of everything. And one of the things that these new types of solutions really need to look at is, are they just replicating that extractive business model? Are they still using labor that's quite exploitive and based on the lowest cost that we can get for labor as possible? And this is one of the things we're starting to look at. The energy transition is actually saying, it's great we're beginning to invest and scale up these solutions, but if we just re-entrench the same extractive and exploitive models, then we actually haven't enabled the transformation that we need. So the message in this story about leadership is to manage across 3 horizons simultaneously, to learn to discern between your H2 minus and your H2 plus, and begin to nudge that next model. Test the mental models that underpin the new solution and use those as a means for innovation, and know your purpose as the compass to navigate dynamic change. So our final story is the story of our children. And this is a story about knowing where you are in time. And I want you to find a pen or pencil and a piece of paper. I know you're highly interactive, so I think you will. And I really mean it. See if you can find a pen and piece of paper, because I'm going to ask you to do something. If you want, you can type it in the chat too, I suppose. We can be digital. So I want you to write down the names of your children and their ages. And if you don't have kids, I actually don't have kids, but write down the name and the age of a child or a young adult that you care for. Give me a yes, I've done it in the chat. Or give me some emojis and let me know how you've done. Great. Good to see those thumbs up. So what we're going to do is look at some of the Ipcc projections vis-a-vis the age of our next generations. And the Ipcc report is something you've probably heard about quite a bit. But very people actually usually read it. It's about 3,000 pages long, but there are some nice summaries within it. And essentially it's put together by the UN, where they assess what are the potential trajectories and likelihoods of different scenarios in terms of climate change. So these are the different levels of warming. I'll walk you through this briefly. What you've got across the little numbers is from 0, 0.5, 1, 1.5, 2, 4, and 5. And you've got a brief summary of what's happening at these different levels. I'll highlight to you that between 1 to 1.5, the reason we work for 1.5 is because that's considered a reasonable amount of risk that we can actually adapt to. Once we get to 2, and that's what we're projected most likely to go over 2, it gets much more difficult to actually adapt. And they did a study that really looked at the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. One example of that distinction is at 1.5 degrees, 95% of the corals are expected to collapse. At 2 degrees, it's 100% of the corals. So we are on this trajectory. Things have not changed. And despite the report that we get each year, we remain on this trajectory. What's considered most likely right now is this between 3 and 4. And that's when we actually have a high risk of a carbon cycle that begins to knock off these cascading effects that release more carbon, and it starts to become outside of our control. Right now, we actually have things within our control, which is our energy system, our food system, and learning to decarbonize our economy. The economy that I spoke to in the very first story. There'll come a point where it'll kick off the type of cascading effects that we won't be able to have that type of control. And about 2057 is about when that's supposed to happen. And that'll be relevant in a moment. So the next slides are supposed to be all animation, and they're not. So I'll just have to walk you through it. Now here's that same trajectory, and I'll walk you through it briefly. We've got time across the bottom. We've got the different levels of warming across the right side. I'm going to start at the top. So the warming projected if we maintain status quo by 2100. The baseline 4.1 to 4.8 with current policies, and this includes the policies from the Paris Agreement, we are anticipated to go to 3.1, 3.5. Current policies do not keep us below that 1.5 threshold that we're aiming for. Optimistic policies, we still go over. With pledges and targets, we still go over. And then there's what would be needed in terms of 2 degrees or 1.5 consistent, where you see that nice yellow and green going down when the IPCC report says this is actually what would need to be done. And this does have implications for business in the context of what it means to enable this transition, because the policies are not yet enough in place, and does business want to take a role in terms of helping to ensure those policies are in place so that we can actually enable this transition. So go with me across a little bit from the bottom up. So I was born in the late 1960s, and if I live a life, let's say to about 1984, until 84, 85, and let's imagine I would pass away in 2053, and let's imagine that I had a child when I was 30, so 1997, and then that child in 2027 has a child that is 30, and then that child in 2057 has a child when they're at age 30. What you see here is that without any shifts, when my grandchild is 30, they are living in that world that is considered almost unsustainable. And that even my children, throughout if they live this long life, are living in that world. And this is based on the Ipcc report, which tends to be more conservative because it's peer reviewed and goes to inform policy. And because of that, they're not being alarmist. They're actually taking what we think is most considerable. So a bit of optimism. I'm going to go into this little decade where we had the nice sloping down yellow and green, and that's the 2020 to 2030. This is taken from a 2018 Ipcc report. And it outlines that if we can decarbonize in these next 10 years, we would be able to get onto this pathway. However, the level of decarbonization, to limit warming to that 1.5, which is considered an acceptable level of warmth, we need to lower carbon emissions 45% from 2010 levels by 2030 and achieve net zero emissions about 2050. And this is why you see many of the corporate commitments to net zero by 2050 right now. What I want you to take away from this, though, is it's not the next generations that are going to solve this. And this is a shout out to my Gen X colleagues. It's actually those in leadership positions today. And there tends to be a tendency that we think, oh, the next generations, they're so passionate about this, they're really going to do it. This next decade actually makes a difference. And if you're in a leadership position today, it's the decisions you're making now that begin to set that trajectory. So the messages from this story are, it means bringing the whole self to work. And this is why I asked you to say, what are the names of your kids and how old will they be? And think about how old they'll be in those scenarios. And how do you bring that love and that passion into whatever role or influence you have within your leadership positions? It's also about knowing what's at stake. And if this is new news to you, or you'd like to learn more, I think it's incumbent upon us to understand this information right now, because it's kind of on our watch, and recognizing the responsibility we have in terms of leadership this decade. So in sum, understand the water, decide what role you'd like to play. Are you building the new or are you riding out the old? You know where my sentiment lies. Start the conversations that spark our imagination for new mental models. Manage change on 3 horizons simultaneously. Bring your whole self to work. Educate yourself about what's at stake and recognize the responsibility of leadership in this decade. In closing, because I think the Ipcc report can be quite depressing, people often ask me, do you have hope or optimism? I often say I don't have optimism, but I do have hope. And hope is definitely not the same as optimism. Optimism is belief that everything will turn out all right. Hope is the belief that something is worth doing regardless of how it turns out. So thank you very much.
Thank you for the inspiring talk and the work that you've been doing for a sustainable future. How important it is to think and work towards sustainable future. Now, taking a cue from it, we have a lot of questions coming in the chat, but we have time for one. So I'm going to go ahead and pick up the question from Guru Nandan Singh. He asks, humans prioritize instant gratification versus future investment. Example, I would spend now rather than save for retirement. Keeping this in mind, how does one catalyze action today for a better sustainable future?
I think it depends on who the somebody that we're talking about, because I would design a different solution for whoever I was talking about, if it's a campaign to youth or if it's executive leadership team. And for executive leadership team, we often use those futures to understand what's the potential risk.
Mhm.
Worked with large companies that help to produce linen. And then when they find out that actually they won't be able to produce linen in the climate scenarios, and it begins to catalyze that shift. With consumers, it's much more challenging. And I don't know how much time we have for questions, so somebody can connect with LinkedIn and I'll try to answer it if you'd like.
Perfect. We will go ahead and have that done. Thank you so much for your time. It was